how long. So we want to transition the box dash shadow, and let's transition it to something natural, like 0.15 seconds. Now save and refresh. Now when we hover over this button, we get a nice transition on the shadow like this. All right, so the last thing we're going to do is, I realized I forgot to change the durations here. So let's change it to 0.15 and 0.15. Save it and refresh. So now this looks something like what we have in our designs. So we just learned some intermediate HTML skills, such as creating hover effects, other pseudo classes, transitions, and shadows. Here are some more exercises from famous websites that you can try to copy. This time we're also going to copy the hover styles. As always, you can find these solutions and more exercise development. In this lesson, we're going to learn about one of the most useful tools for web development called the Chrome DevTools. And we're going to use the DevTools to get perfect colors for our buttons. So first of all, what are the Chrome DevTools? So I find that it's a lot easier to demonstrate it than to try to explain it. So let's go to our website, and we're going to right click in an empty area, and we're going to click Inspect. And this will open up the DevTools. So the cool thing about this is that we can now see all the HTML on our page. If we drill down here, we can see all the buttons. So this is a great way to visualize the HTML as well as the CSS on our page. If I click into one of these buttons, I can see all the CSS that is applied to this button. So what's even better is that we can open the DevTools in any website that we want. So we can actually open it in supersimple.dev, and you can see all the HTML that is on this website as well as all the CSS. So this is a really great tool where you can open it in any website that you want and see the exact styles that they're using on that website. The next feature I want to show you is this pointer icon in the top left. So instead of trying to find these buttons in all of this HTML, we can actually click this pointer icon, and it will let us hover over any element on the web page and show it down here. So if we hover over this tweet button and click it, it will find the element for us in the HTML. And now we can look at these styles here to see what kind of styles, and more importantly, what kind of background color is set on this button so that we can get a perfect background color. So one thing to note is that this background color is actually another way of measuring color. So currently we learned about RGB. Now we have another way of measuring color, and this is called hex. It's basically the same as RGB. The first two characters here, 1 and D, represent how much red, the second two represent how much green, and the third two represent how much blue. So with a little bit of math, we can convert from hex to RGB. So I just Google a hex to RGB calculator, and I find any calculator, and then I use it to convert the hex value. So I'm going to copy this into the calculator and then convert it, and it will give me the RGB value. So it'll do that math for me. So that's just another way of measuring color called hex. The next feature I want to show you in the DevTools is this Computed tab. So this tab actually shows us all the final styles that are applied to this element. So we can actually scroll down here and we can find the background color in the RGB value. We can also find things like the height, the final calculated height, the final calculated width. so that we can get the perfect size as well as the perfect background color. So let's actually just use the background color here. And we're going to copy this and paste this into our code. So we're going to get an exact color instead of trying to guess it like we were before. So if I copy and paste here, save it, and semicolon, how you use our button color is going to match the design exactly. That means that we added space on the outside of the button and save and right to 8. If now there's 30 pixel directions, top, right, bottom, and left. Let's try adding margin to the left side of the button this time. Margin we're basing on. So currently, if we look at our code, we're setting the height and width of our buttons. And this is not actually a good idea. I'll show you why. I'm going to scroll down to the join button because it's a little easier to see. And I'm going to change the text to join my channel. Save it and refresh. And you'll notice that the text is actually overflowing the button like this. And that's because if we scroll up, we're setting the height and the width. That means that we're forcing the button to have a height of 36 pixels and a width of 62 pixels. But here, notice that our content is too big. So what we want to do is to remove these lines and save it and refresh the page. And by default, our button actually adjusts the size automatically based on the content. So now instead of setting the height and the width, we're going to achieve the same thing by adding spacing on the inside of the button. So the spacing on the inside of the button is called padding. Let's go into our code and give it a try. So we're going to add padding dash left of 30 pixels. Save it and refresh. And you can see that padding adds spacing on the inside of the button. And just like margin, we can set padding in all 4 directions. So let's try adding padding dash top to 20 pixels. Save that and refresh. And now you can see that we added padding on the top by 20 pixels. So we can actually use the Chrome dev tools that we learned earlier to visualize the margin and padding of our elements. Let's go into a blank area of our webpage, and we're going to right click and inspect, and then click this top left icon, and then click our subscribe button. So I'm going to drag this down, and then we're going to go into the computed tab. So this section is basically the box model. We have our margin, which is the space on the outside of the element. You can see that highlighted in orange. We have the border, which we learned earlier, and we have the padding, which is the space on the inside of the element, which you can see highlighted in green. Buttons by default have a padding of 6 pixels on the left and right, and 1 pixel on top and bottom. So let's click this top left again and go to our join button and click this button. In this example, we have padding on the top of 20 pixels, which is what we have in our code. We have padding on the left of 30 pixels, also what we have in our code. And then we have a default padding of 6 pixels on the right and 1 pixel at the bottom. And for this button, we have a border of 1 pixel wide, which you can see here in our code. So all of these combined make up the CSS box model. This basically determines how much space an element takes up on the page and how far it is away from other elements. So now that we learned the box model, we're going to use it to recreate our design here. So currently, if we look at our code, we're using height and width. Let's replace this with the box model. Let's get rid of this and save it and refresh. And now our button's back to what it was before. And now we're going to add padding to this button so that it matches the design at the bottom here. So let's add some padding dash top of 10 pixels. So we'll add spacing on the inside of the button at the top here of 10 pixels. We're also going to add padding dash bottom of 10 pixels. So let's save that and refresh. Okay, so now we have space at the top and bottom. So that looks pretty close. We're also going to add space on the inside, on the left and right. So we're going to add padding dash left of 16 pixels and padding on the right. And I think this looks close enough. So using padding, we added spacing on this and save it and refresh. And the good thing about this is it will resize with the text, but it will. And let's actually move these buttons back closer together. So currently, if we scroll up, we have margin on the right of 30 pixels. So spacing on the outside of the button on the right of 30 pixels. We're going to change it back to 8 pixels so that it's closer like we have in our design. Save it and refresh. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Now, one thing you'll notice is that our buttons are not aligned with each other. So the join button is all the way at the top, while our subscribe button is a little bit below. Pixels. So spacing on the outside of the button on the right of 30 pixels. We're going to change it back to 8 pixels so that it's closer like we have in our design. Save it. Buttons are low. the browser behavior and align everything to the top like we had before, we can go into our CSS and we're going to add a property called vertical-align. And we're going to set this to top. So instead of aligning the buttons based on the text like this, we're just going to align everything to the top. If we save that and refresh, now the subscribe button is aligned to the top, which is right there. Let's do the same thing for the tweet button. We're going to scroll down and we're going to add vertical-align : top here as well. Save and refresh. And now everything's aligned properly again. Now let's work on the join button. I'm going to scroll down and remove this extra text here. Save it and refresh. And now we're going to go to our CSS for the join button. So I'll scroll up to right here and we're going to adjust the padding. So let's actually just borrow the padding from the subscribe button because they look pretty similar. So I'll scroll up here and copy these and just move them down to the join button right here. Save that and refresh. Okay, so that looks pretty good, except our join button looks a little bit off. It looks a little bit taller than our subscribe button. And that's because the border actually adds a little bit of size to this button. So it adds 1 pixel on the top and bottom. That's why this button is taller than the subscribe button. So to compensate, we're actually going to reduce the padding at the top and the bottom by 1 pixel. Save it and refresh. And now they're the same size. We have 9 pixels of space on the inside plus the 1 pixel of the border width. And that matches the 10 pixels of space on the inside of the subscribe button. And I'll leave changing the tweet button up to you as an exercise. So that is the CSS box model. Every element can have spacing on the outside called margin, space on the inside called padding, as well as a border concept and these properties. Here's some exercises of you to get yourself more familiar with this concept and these properties. Yourself more familiar with this concept and these properties.
I need to make a button that stretches when I hover. So let me just. It's quite slow, so I think that see that, and I also want to do reverse of
pretty easy.
I'm just going to show you all this. So next one we're going to make is this 3D click one. So the moment he clicks it, this shadow pops up. So let's make a new button. First things, button class is, let's call it shadow. specific button because this is for all pretty much. This still does its thing. That's pretty cool. And dot shadow button. I want shadow to pop up. Let's see. Whoa. So, if you look at 4K, right, so 4K we have margin and padding together. So, although the padding is increasing, the margin isn't decreasing. So, see, because you see the padding is increasing here, but this one's going further away. Let me just try and do that. How do I get a space here? Oh, I can do on top here. I don't even need because this is only the only two. So I can just come down here and I can do div and then you can see the margin. So auto is not doing it, so holy shit, there's so many like Jesus Christ. Okay, cool. So we have that. Right, and then over here we're gonna do, so these two are gonna have the same functionality. So let's just call these class is equal to number. Down here, we're gonna do dot number button right on I'm sure there's a better way to do this, but I don't know right now. So this one. Right, so I'm gonna make like this. These move. So right, so the problem is these move. So so they have 10 pixels anyway, so let's make these. So I think these 15. It looks like it's moving a little bit more now. Okay, we can do that later. So let's make this 17. And this looks about right. The cool part is that it isn't moving, so let's just do put a new margin on top. Let's do 30 pixels off. Right, so it's way too much. See this whole thing. So when we hover it, the padding is increasing at the same time the margin is decreasing. Huh? Okay, so we know. Okay, let's make the margin 20 pixels. I'm saying as the padding is increasing, padding is increasing by 7, so the margin should decrease by 7. So if I make this 10 pixels, you don't even need that. What if I make this 7 pixels? Right, but then you get margin 0 pixels, 0 pixels. Will this work? No, still moving. Okay, so the margins. Yeah, so okay. I'm gonna make this 10 pixels, right? And then the padding before this is gonna be. So, well, the moment we hover, we want to make the padding right 25, padding left 25. But then at the same time, we want to decrease the margin left at the same amount, and then the margin right at the same amount, which we increase it 10%. That still doesn't work. Okay, I'm just looking at the solution. It's because I didn't add the transition. That works. Oh, okay. So it was inheriting the padding transition from button, but it wasn't transition the margin. So if I remove this, I'm gonna get the whole glitchy problem. If I add this, it just seamlessly. Yeah, there we go. Oh, that's pretty cool. It's hello? Hello?
buttons. In this lesson, we're going to work with text, and we're going to learn how to text. So we're going to go to supersimple.dev/exercises/text. And now we have some text from YouTube and Apple that we're going to learn how to copy. So first of all, let's create a new HTML file where we can focus on practicing text styles. So I'm going to go here and create a new file, and let's just call this text.html. And now we're going to open this file in our browser. So open the folder that contains our code and right-click open with Google Chrome. I'm actually going to put this up here. All right, so now we're ready to begin. If you've ever written a text document before using something like Google Docs or Microsoft Word, you've probably seen something like this. This is a toolbar that allows us to change the style of our text. We can change the font, the text size, we can make it bold, we can center it, etc. In CSS, we have a style for each of these things. Let's go to our code, and we're going to first start by creating some text on our page. So let's first create a paragraph. And then inside our paragraph, let's start with the text here. So I'm going to copy and paste this into our paragraph, and I'm just going to reorganize the code a little bit and save. Remember that in HTML, these extra spaces and new lines don't matter. Now refresh the page, and we have our first paragraph that we can practice with.
Made a weird sound once. Obviously.
Next, let's create a style element so we can write some CSS code. Now we'll set a class on this paragraph so that we can target it in CSS. Class equals video-title, because this is a video title that I copied from YouTube. So let's save it and refresh. And now we can start targeting this paragraph in our CSS. So remember, we're going to start with a dot to target a class, and we're going to target video-title. So the first thing we're going to change is the font. To change the font, the CSS property is font-family. So websites by default use the font called Times New Roman. We're going to change the font to a font called Arial. Save it and refresh. And now you can see we changed the font. Let's go to the next one. So this is the font size. And we can change the font size using the property font-size. And let's change it to something like 30 pixels. Save it and refresh. And now we have a bigger font. The next example is let's make it bold. We're going to go here and we're going to set the font-weight to be bold. Save it and refresh. And now we have bold font. So as you can see, CSS has properties for doing all of these things. And for most of these properties, it's pretty easy to Google them. For example, let's Google for how to make a font italic. So we'll go to Google, and we just need to search something like CSS text italic. And now in the first result, we're going to go in here. And if you scroll down, you can see this CSS font style italic. So I'm going to copy this and paste it in my code, save it and refresh. And now we have italic text. The last one I'm going to show you for now is how to center this text, because in our exercise, we have an exercise where the text is centered. To center text, we're going to go to our code and we're going to type text-align. So this is the property for centering text, or putting it to the left or to the right. Now we're going to give a value of center. Save it and refresh. And that's how we center our text. So that was pretty easy, right? Now let's go ahead and try to copy this style in our exercise. So if you remember, the general strategy for creating anything that we see is first create the element with HTML and then style it with CSS one by one. Let's go ahead and do that for this exercise. I'm just going to resize this back, and we're going to start by resetting all of these styles. Save it and refresh. First, I'm going to start with the font family. So for this exercise, I actually use the font family Arial just to make it easier for us. So we're going to set the font-family to Arial. Save it and refresh. Next, I'm going to change the font weight. So this font is bold, and I want to make my font bold as well. So we're going to add font-weight bold. Save it and refresh. Next, let's change the font size. So I'm going to change this font size to something bigger, like maybe 20 pixels. Save it and refresh. And it looks a little too big compared to the design, so let's tone it down just a little bit, maybe 18 pixels. Save and refresh. Okay, so I think that looks close enough. Next, you'll notice that this text sort of wraps around to a second line, while ours doesn't. The way to make this happen is we're going to set a width on this title. Now I know that in the previous section, we said it's bad to set a width, but here it's actually what we want. Because if we set a width, we're going to force the text onto a second line. So let's go ahead and set a width right now. And I'll set it to something like 400 pixels. Let's see how that looks. Save it and refresh. Okay, so it needs to be less than that. Let's do 300 pixels. Save and refresh. Okay, so that looks right to me now. And the final thing with the title is I notice there's more spacing between the lines here than what we have. So to adjust the spacing between lines, the property is called line-height. So don't worry if it seems like we're learning a lot of new properties. The point of this lesson is for us to go through some complicated examples together, which will prepare you for the exercises that you can practice on your own. So for this line height, let's try something like 20 pixels. Save it and refresh. Okay, so it looks like that didn't work. Let's change it to 26 maybe. Save it and refresh. Okay, maybe 24. Save and refresh. Okay, so I think that looks pretty close. Next, let's work on the second paragraph. So we're going to create a new paragraph, 3.4 M views. And now to create this dot, we're going to create something called an HTML entity. So an HTML entity lets us type out special characters. For example, this dot and this checkmark. To get the HTML entity for this dot, we're going to Google HTML entity middle dot. And now if we scroll down, this will give us some HTML code that we can copy into our code. So I'm going to copy this and then paste it here. And that's going to create a dot on our page. So if I save it and refresh, that's what we get. Now I'm going to type out the rest of the text in this paragraph. Now save that and refresh. So now remember, the general process is we created the element with HTML. Now we're going to style it one by one. First, let's give this a class so we can target it. Let's call this video-stats. And now in our CSS, we're going to style this text. So we're going to start with font-family Arial. Save and refresh. And then we're going to change the font size. So it looks like our design is a little bit smaller than what we have. Let's change the font size to maybe 14 pixels. Save and refresh. And I think that looks pretty close. Next, let's change the color. So let's set a color of maybe gray and refresh. Okay, so that's a little too light. So to get an exact color, we can right click in a blank area of the web page, click inspect, and then we're going to inspect the styles of this element. So the trick to doing that is we're going to click this top left icon, hover over this element and click it. And then we can find all its styles in the computed tab. So if we scroll down, we can get the text color. Let's copy this and save. Let's refresh. And that looks pretty good compared to the design. Next, let's adjust the spacing between these two paragraphs. So remember from the previous lesson, the spacing outside of an element is called a margin. But if we look at our code, we didn't actually set any margin yet. So why is there so much space between these two paragraphs? And the reason is, if we right click in an empty area of the web page and click inspect, and we click this icon and hover over this paragraph already has margin at the top and bottom. So if we click this, go to computed, it has 14 pixels of margin at the top and 14 at the bottom. And the same thing for this paragraph. And the reason for this is because paragraphs by default come with margin at the top and at the bottom. So that's why there's all this spacing that we have here where we didn't set it in the CSS. So the general process is we're going to remove the default spacing and then we're going to set our own spacing. So let's go into our code. And first we're going to remove the margin dash bottom. of the title, set that to 0, and we're also going to remove the margin at the top of the second paragraph and set it to 0. Save that and refresh, and now there's no default spacing between these and they're really close together. Next, we can set a more precise margin bottom. So let's set it to maybe 20 pixels. Let's see how that looks. Save it and refresh. Okay, so that's way too much space. Let's tone it down to something like maybe 5. Save and refresh. Okay, so I think this looks pretty close to the design actually. Let's move on to the next paragraph. We're gonna move all the way down and create a new paragraph element with this text inside. And now for this check mark, we're also going to use an HTML entity. Now I know that you can actually copy this and put it into our code directly, but some browsers might not support this, so that's why we're using HTML entities. We're gonna go to Google, and we're gonna search HTML entity check mark. And I'm gonna scroll down and grab the HTML entity here. So here we actually have 3. I'm just gonna take the first one. Copy, paste, save it. Let's go back and refresh. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Next, let's keep styling these one by one. So I'm gonna go a little bit faster here because it's basically the same thing that we've been doing for the first 2. Let's call this one video author, and then we'll style it up here. So we'll set the font family to Arial, like the rest of the paragraphs. I'm gonna set the color to the same as this paragraph. Let's copy and paste. Okay, that looks pretty good. Oh yeah, we have to set the font size. Looks a little too big right now. Set the font size to 14 pixels. Next, we're going to reset the default spacing here. So we're going to set the margin dash bottom and remove it by setting it to 0, and also remove the margin top and set it to 0. Save and refresh. And now we're going to set a more precise margin. So let's try maybe 30 pixels. See how that looks. Okay, that's way too much. Maybe 20 pixels. Okay, I think that looks about right. Then we're going to do the third paragraph. Let's go down here, create the element, and then style it with CSS. Just going to copy and paste this in here. Save and refresh. First, let's give a class to the text so that we can target it. Let's call this video-description. Go up here, video-description. We want a font family of Arial, a font size of 14 pixels, and the same color. And we save it and refresh. Okay, that looks pretty good. And now we want to give it a width to make it wrap around like this. So let's set the width to the same as the title, which is 300. Width 300 pixels. Save and refresh. Okay, so it looks like this IO is actually on a separate line. Let's make it 280. Save and refresh. All right, so that looks pretty good. And I'm also gonna make it 280 up here, just to make sure they're the same. So the last thing I'm gonna change is the height or the space between these lines. To do that, we're gonna use line height. Let's scroll down and then add another property called line-height. And let's set this to 20 pixels. Let's see how that looks. Save and refresh. And let's set it to maybe 22 pixels. Save and refresh. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with this. And lastly, we're going to modify the space between these 2 paragraphs. First, we're going to reset the default margin. Let's get rid of the margin bottom on the first one here and the margin top on the second one. So margin-top, we're going to get rid of it and set it to 0. Save and refresh. And then we're going to set a margin bottom. Maybe the same thing as up here, 20 pixels. Save and refresh. All right, so that looks really good to me. We just recreated a really nice looking style that you can find on youtube.com. And the general process that we used is first we created the elements with HTML, and then we styled them with CSS one by one. So before we move on to the next exercise, I'm going to show you a way to clean up our code. So if you notice, all of our styles right now have a line called font family Arial. Now we can actually clean this up and remove the duplication by creating a new style. This time we're going to target all paragraphs on the page, and we're going to give all paragraphs font-family:Arial. Save. So this style is going to apply to all paragraphs, which means all of these. That means that we actually don't need this line in any of these class styles anymore. So we can actually remove all of these. Now, if I save it and I refresh, you can see that nothing changes because this is doing the same thing as the code that we had before. So you can also see from this example that an element can be targeted by two sets of styles. For example, for this code here, we're targeting all p elements on the page and all elements with a class of video-title. If we scroll down here we have a p element that has a class of video-title, which means it's going to be targeted by both this set of styles and this set of styles. So it's being targeted by multiple sets of styles. Now, another thing that we can clean up is, remember how we reset the margins for all of our paragraphs? Instead of doing it for each one individually, we can actually put it all up here. So for example, we can set the margin dash top to 0 and the margin dash bottom to 0. We save it and we refresh. It looks pretty much the same, except we're now cleaning up all of the default styles up here so that we don't have to do it in our code at the bottom. So we don't need this anymore, or this, or this. If we save that and refresh, we still get the same thing because we've reset all of our styles in this set of styles. Now, the last concept I want to show you before we move on to the next exercise is the fact that in this set of styles, we're setting the margin bottom to 0. But here, we're also setting the margin bottom to 5 pixels and the margin bottom to 20 pixels. So how does that work? We're setting it to 0 here and to 5 and 20 here. Which style does the element actually get? And the answer is we're getting the style down here. So if we refresh, you'll notice that there's still 20 pixels of space between these two paragraphs. Now you might think that it's because this line is at the top, and then once we get to this line, it overrides anything that comes before it. But if we actually move this to the top, and we save and reload, you'll see that we still have 20 pixels of margin bottom. So why is this happening? This is something called CSS specificity. If we have multiple lines setting the same property, there's actually a priority that the browser follows. So in this situation, this style has more priority than this style. And to determine which one has more priority, we have to look at this word before the brackets. So this word tells us what these styles are targeting. This is known as a selector. This is another selector that targets a particular class. Now the selector that is the most specific is going to have higher priority. So this selector is actually more specific than paragraphs. So what I mean by specific is that this targets all paragraphs on the page, and this targets a specific class. So not all paragraphs are going to have this class of video-stats. So that's why this is more specific. It targets a smaller group of elements than this. That's why this line has priority over this line. So that's just an introduction to CSS specificity. For now, just know that a class name like this has more priority than an element name like this. So I'm going to move this code back and we'll continue with the rest of this exercise. Next, we're going to copy this text from Apple. So you can see that there is a background color and the text is centered. And also if I hover over this part of the text, we get a pointer on our mouse and we have an underlined text. So let's see how we can do this. First, we'll create the element and then we'll style it one by one. So we'll go down here and we're going to with an H grader and paste the graph clear to the bottom. Class equals, okay, and so we can target it in our CSS. We're going to start by adding a class to our and easier. And now the notice is that the font family is already Arial. If we scroll back up to Arial, save it, now and then go to the computed. It's called text underline decoration property. We scroll down with an overline line through and save and refresh. Now, unfortunately, this property actually affects the entire paragraph, but we want it to only affect this part of the text. So how do we do that? We're going to need to learn something called a text element. So a text element is an element that is inside a line of text. So let's do an example just to see how it works. We're going to go to the bottom and we're going to create a new paragraph to practice with. And let's actually just copy this text and put it in there. Save and refresh. Now we're going to create some text elements on this paragraph. So the first text element I'm going to show you is called the strong element. So now let's copy maybe this text and then put it in there. And save and refresh. So the strong element here creates this bolded text that you see on the web page. So the thing to know about text elements is that they essentially exist inside a line of text and then they modify that part of the text. So they're not modifying the whole thing. Another text element we can create is the U element. So this one creates some text that is underlined. So if we move this text into here, save it and refresh, we now get an underlined text element. So that is how we style specific parts of a line of text. The final element here, but you'll notice that nothing changed. And that's because the span element is the most generic text element. It has no styles. So the span is really useful because we can actually give it a could text elements come with a default style and text. So if we and then we get any style and thing is that everything we apply what we want, just like up here. Let's move this line. I'm going to wrap this in a span. Just going to move this into here. And now in our CSS. Save it and refresh. And now when we hover over this, it's going to turn our mouse into a pointer and it's going to underline it. So we've achieved the exact same styles as our design. So there's one last thing I'm going to show you in this lesson. Let's go back into our code. We're going to scroll all the way to the bottom and recall that in HTML, if we have multiple spaces like this, it will combine them all into one space. So if I save this and refresh, you'll see that only one space shows up here. So I'm going to show you how to get over this problem. Basically, instead of typing out multiple spaces in our HTML, all we have to do is set a margin left on this text element. So we're going to set a margin left on this element, and it's going to add spaces on the left. So as an example, let's scroll up, and we're going to add margin dash left to our span element here, and let's do something like 12 pixels. Save it and refresh, and now we have spacing between our words. So this is how we achieve multiple spaces between our words, even though HTML combines them. So that is how we create really professional looking text like this and like this. We first create the element with HTML, and then we style it one by one with CSS. And if we want to style only just a part of the text, we have to use a text element like a span. In this lesson, we're going to learn the proper structure of HTML, and that's going to give us access to all the features of HTML. So up until this point, we actually haven't been following that structure. For example, if we look at our code, we scroll down, we can see that we're creating elements directly like this. If we go to our website, however, and we right click and inspect, and we look at our HTML, we can see that we have some elements here called the HTML element, the head element, and the body element. So this is a structure that we're actually supposed to, and every HTML should go inside the head element. We're mixing two different languages, all of our styles back, and that's because we're loading all the CSS HTML. The title again, it, and href. And inside here, we're going to pick the styles that we want. So for example, it provides a lot of really great free fonts that we can use. So we're going to open a new tab, and we're going to search for Google Fonts. And we're going to go into this first link. Now this website might look a little different for you, but the general process is the same. First, we're going to search for a font that we like. So a good font to use here is Roboto. And this is the font that we're going to use for our final project. We're going to pick this font, and then inside here, we're going to pick the styles that we want. So for example, I'm going to pick the regular style, and I'm also going to pick the bold style here. So I'm going to pick the bold style. And then I'm going to go to the basket of fonts that I selected, and then Google is going to give me the code that I need to load these fonts. All we need to do is copy this code exactly, and then put it in our head section of our HTML. So we're going to put it in our structure in this head section. And now we've loaded a new font that we can use on our website. So now let's go back to our website, and we're going to use this new font. So remember that currently we set our fonts to Arial. This time we loaded the font called Roboto, and that's what we're going to use. So let's change Arial here to Roboto. Now when I save, the font is going to change. And there you go. It might not look that much different because Roboto is very similar to Arial, but if we inspect and we click on this element and go to the Computer tab, we'll see that the font family has now been changed to Roboto. So this is how we can load a huge selection of fonts from Google onto our webpage and use them on our website. So those are the features that we get from following this HTML structure. Every website that we create from now on will always have an HTML tag, a head and a body, and a doc type at the top. Ready to work on the final project of this course, recreating YouTube.com. Just like before, I've created a page on my website that'll show us what the final project looks like. So first, we're going to close all of our browser tabs because we're going to start over again, and then we're going to open a new page. And we're going to go to supersimple.dev/exercises/YouTube. So on this page, you can see what our final project will look like. So we're going to learn how to recreate YouTube.com that you see here. So first, let's set up our project in our code editor. So let's go into here, and let's actually create a folder that's going to contain all of our previous code. So the final project is going to contain a lot of code, so we don't want to get it confused with the previous lessons. So let's call this intro-to-html. And we're going to put everything inside this folder. I'm going to put this in here, and these HTML files in here as well. Next, we're going to create a new HTML file for our final project. So let's create a file called youtube.html. And I actually put it inside this folder. I'm going to take it out by dragging it down here. So now we have an intro to HTML folder and our youtube.html, and we're ready to get started. First, we're going to set up the proper structure of HTML that we learned in the previous lesson. So we're going to start off with a less than exclamation doc type and HTML. And then we're going to create an HTML element that's going to contain our entire web page. And inside here, we're going to have a head element. And we're also going to have a body element. And now that we have the structure, we can open it with Live Server. And now we have our blank page. So this page is going to automatically reload when we change our code. Now, before we can work on the final project, we need to learn 2 more HTML elements: how to load images onto our website and how to create a search box. So let's start with loading images first. So I'm going to show you how you can download these thumbnails from my website. We're going to right click in a blank area and inspect. And now if we click this icon in the top left, and hover over an image and click it, and you might need to drag this down to see the HTML. We can find the image in the HTML, and here is the URL for the image. So we can actually click this, and it will open the image in a new tab, and we can Control S to save it. So make sure we save this image in the folder that contains all of our code. So that's this folder for me. I'm going to save it, and now in my code editor, I can see the image. Next, we're going to create an HTML element to load this onto our page. So I'm going to go back to my page here, and then we're going to go into the body and create the image element, which is less than img greater than. Now the image element is unique because it's another void element. So we mentioned void elements briefly in the previous lesson. It's an element that doesn't require a closing tag. So this is one of those exceptions to the rule. So the image element takes one attribute called src. Now this attribute tells the computer which image to display on the website. So for us, that image is the one we downloaded called thumbnail1.webp. So we're going to display thumbnail-1.webp. And when I save it, the image is now loaded onto our website. So this source URL, get this in a blank area. And inspect. And now if we click, and you might need to drag this down the image. So we can access to save it. So make sure we save this image in the folder that contains all of our code. So that's this folder for me. I'm going to save it. And now in my code editor, I can see the image. Next, we're going to create an HTML element to load this onto our page. So I'm going to go back to my page here, and then we're going to go into the body and create the image element, which is less than img greater than. Now the image element is unique because it's another void element. So we mentioned void elements briefly in the previous lesson. It's an element that doesn't require a closing tag. So this is one of those exceptions to the rule. So the image element takes one attribute called src. Now this attribute tells the computer which image to display on the website. So for us, that image is the one we downloaded called thumbnail1.webp. So we're going to display thumbnail-1.webp. And when I save it, the image is now loaded onto our website. So this source attribute works the same way as the link attribute that we saw earlier. It follows the rules of file paths to locate our file. So just as a reminder, if we type thumbnail1.webp here, it's going to look for a file named thumbnail1.webp right beside our HTML file. It's going to find it and then load it onto our website. But now we're actually going to create a folder because we have multiple thumbnails and we want to organize them. We're going to create a folder called thumbnails. And we're going to drag this into that folder. So now for the source attribute, we don't have a file beside our HTML called thumbnail1.webp, and then you see this error here. So this means that there is an error loading an image. Now to find it in the thumbnails file, we're going to type thumbnails/thumbnail1.webp. So first, it's going to look for a file or folder called thumbnails beside the HTML file. It finds this one, and then the slash here means to go inside the folder and then find this file inside that folder, which is here. So that's how we load images onto our page. Now we're going to learn how to style our image elements. So let's go into our head section here and create a style element. Now before we do that, I forgot to do something, which is let's create a title for our page. So we can call this youtube.com clone. And if we save this, the title will show up in the tabs. All right, so let's learn how to style our image. So as always, we're going to give it a class attribute. And let's just call this thumbnail. And now we can target this class in our CSS. So dot thumbnail. Now all of the CSS properties that we learned so far apply to the image. Some of them make sense and some of them don't. So one property that obviously doesn't make sense is something like font-size. So if I save it, you'll see nothing changes because there is no text inside this element. It's an image. So even though this works, it doesn't really change anything. Now a property that does make sense for an image is width. So this will set the width of this image. Let's make it smaller to match what we have here. So let's make the width something like 300 pixels. Now we save it. Now the width of this image is 300 pixels. So one thing you might notice is that when we set the width of an image, the height also changes. So before we had this, notice that the image was a lot taller. But as soon as we set the width, the height also adjusts. So that's one behavior of images that we should know. When we set the width, the height will also adjust so that the image has the same dimensions. What I mean by same dimensions is that it keeps the same shape. So for example, if I set the height as well, this is going to cause the image to lose its shape or lose its dimensions. Let's set the height to something like 600 pixels. Save it. And now you'll see that the image is 600 pixels tall, but it's lost its shape. And now it's becomes stretched. If I set the height as well, this is going to cause the image to lose its shape or lose its dimensions. Let's set the height to something like 600 pixels. Save it. And now you'll see that the image is 600 pixels tall, but it's lost its shape and now it's become stretched. So that behavior of an image sort of keeps us safe. So it keeps the image looking. Nice. Now, if we really wanted an image that was exactly 300 pixels by 300 pixels, what can we do? So this image, as you can see, is getting stretched out. So in addition to all all the CSS properties that we learned so far, the image element has its own properties that are specific to an image. So one of these is called object fit. So this determines what happens if this size doesn't match the image's dimensions or the image's shape. So for example, I can set a value of cover. So this tells the image to cover this 300 by 300 area, but it's also going to keep its shape. So this area might not be big enough to show the whole image, which may or may not be okay depending on what we want to do. Now we can adjust which part of the image that we see using another property called object-position. So currently we're looking at the center of the image. We can set the object position to left. Currently, depending on what we want to do. So this area might not be full. I can set a value of cover. So this tells the image to cover this 300 by 300 area, but it's also going to keep its shape. So this area might not be big enough to show the whole image, which may or may not be okay depending on what we want to do. Now we can adjust which part of the image that we see using another property called object-position. So currently we're looking at the center of the image. We can set the object position to left to view the left side of the image, or we can also set it to the right to view the right side of the image, in the case that the image doesn't fit in our area. Another value we can give to object fit is contain. So if we save this, the entire image is going to shrink until it is contained in this 300 by 300 area. So I'm going to set a border so that we can see what this is doing. I'm going to set a border of 2 pixels, border width of 2 pixels, border style solid, border color of red. So here, the border shows us our 300 by 300 area, and contain makes the image shrink until it is contained in the area. But that means that it might not be able to cover the entire area if it's not the right shape. So in this case, the object position can move the image to the top or to the bottom. So that's basically how images work. As you can see, a lot of the CSS properties that we learned before, like width and height and border, can be applied to the image element, and the image element also has some of its own properties that determine how the image is displayed. So for now, let's create something that's kind of like our final website. So I'm going to set the image width to 300, and I'm not going to set a height so that the image doesn't stretch and we don't have to do all this stuff. And I can actually just remove all of this. So the only thing I'm doing is telling the image to shrink down to a width of 300 and to shrink the height as well so that the image keeps its shape. So we're going to stick with this for now, and this is going to correspond to this part of our final project. And we're going to start learning how to build out the entire video preview. The next element we're going to learn in this lesson is how to create search boxes like the one you see up here. So let's go back into our website and we'll learn the code for creating a search box. The HTML for creating a text box is less than input greater than. So the input element is a void element, just like the image element. It doesn't require a closing tag. So the input element has several attributes that we can give it. One of them is called the type. So if we set the type equals text, it's going to give us a text box. I'm going to save this, and now in our HTML, you can see we have a text box. Another type that we can give to this input is called checkbox. So if I save this, now we have a checkbox. So for our purposes, we're going to set the type to a text box because we want to create the YouTube search box up here. So you also notice that this text box has a word search in it. And when I start typing, now we have several attributes that we can give it. One of them is called the type. So if we set the type equals text, it's going to give us a text box. I'm going to save this, and now in our HTML, you can see we have a text box. Another type that we can give to this input is called checkbox. So if I save this, now we have a checkbox. So for our purposes, we're going to set the type to a text box because we want to create the YouTube search box up here. So you also notice that this text box has a word search in it. And when I start typing, that search word is gone. So this is sort of like a label for the user, telling them what to put into this text box. And this is known as a placeholder. So if we go back to our website, we're going to add a placeholder to our new text box. To do that, we're just going to give the attribute placeholder. And let's set the placeholder as search. We save it. Now we have a placeholder that disappears when we start typing. So that's how we create what we see on YouTube. So for the text box, all of the CSS properties that we learned so far can be used on the text box. So let's look at some examples. Let's add a class attribute first, like always, so that we can target it. Let's call it search-bar. And then inside our CSS, we're going to target .search bar class. And then inside, we can set our usual CSS properties. So for example, in this case, we can set a font-size. And let's set it to 20 pixels. Save it and reload. And now you can see that the font size has changed. Another thing we can change is margin, or the spacing. So let's add some margin to the left of 12 pixels. Save it, and now we have some spacing on the left. So basically everything that we've learned so far about CSS properties, we can use on the search box. For now, let's remove these example styles, and we're going to style the search box to look like our final project later in this course. Save, we'll see it. Xbox. And I'm not gonna set up. As you can see, a lot of these CSS properties that we learned before, like width and height, and like In this lesson, we're going to learn one of the most important CSS properties called the display property, and we're going to use this to start building out our final project. We're going to start off by taking a look at our final project, and we're going to start building out the text here. So we're going to create paragraphs for these text. So let's go into our code, and we're going to create 3 paragraphs. So here's one of them, and we can copy the text, copy, paste. So here's another paragraph, and we're going to copy this and paste it in our code. And here's a final paragraph. And we'll save. So here I'm actually going to use the HTML entity again instead of this special character. So to save us some time, I'm just going to type it out here. Now I'm going to save this and go back to my web page. And now we have the text that we're going to use. But you might notice something weird. How come this text box is beside our image? If we look at our paragraphs, they are on top of each other. So one after another on each line. How come text boxes and images appear on the same line? So this is due to the display property in CSS, and we're going to learn what that is right now. In HTML, there are 3 types of elements. The first type of element is called a block element. A block element takes up the entire line. So a paragraph paragraph by default is a block element. We can see that in our DevTools by right-clicking in the browser, and then clicking Inspect, and then clicking this icon in the top left, right here, and then hovering over our paragraph. So you can see that even though the text goes to here, the paragraph extends to the end of the line, because the paragraph by default is a block element. Block elements take up the entire line. So let's go into our code, and I'm going to demonstrate another property of block elements. If we set a class on the paragraph and we style it, so let's set a class of video-title. Let's save it, and we're going to style it, and let's give it a width of 300 pixels. Save and refresh. And now this paragraph is only 300 pixels, so it's not stretching to the end of the line anymore. Let's verify that using the DevTools by clicking this top left and then hovering over. So you see that the paragraph itself only takes a width of 300 like we set in our CSS, but it still takes up the entire line, denoted by the orange part on the right here. If we click on this paragraph and we go to the Computed tab, notice that there is no margin on the right side, but we still have a ton of orange area on the right. So this is how block elements work. Regardless of how much space they actually take up, they take up the entire line. So they're forced to be on their own line, like this paragraph and these two paragraphs. So that's what a block element means. The second type of element is an inline block element. An inline block element only takes up as much space as it needs to, and doesn't take up the entire line. An example of an inline block element is the image element and the input element. They only take up as much space as they need to, and they don't take up the entire line, so another element could appear beside them, like we see here. So that's the inline block element. The third type of basic HTML element is called the inline element. Inline elements are basically just text elements. They appear within a line of text. So if you remember, we briefly introduced the element strong. So this element appears within a line of text, like this. So this element makes a part of the text bold, and it appears within a line of text. So those are the three basic types of HTML elements: a block element, which takes up the entire line, an inline block element, which only takes up as much space as it needs to, and an inline element, which appears within a line of text. Now, the most interesting of these three are the block elements and the inline block elements, because they determine how these elements are displayed on the page, whether beside each other or above and below. In addition, we can use a CSS property called display to easily switch between block and inline block. So let's see how that would work. So first, let's start by switching from block to inline block. We're going to switch both of these paragraphs to inline block elements. Let's go into our code, and we're going to give this a class. Let's call this video-author, and let's call this video-stats. And we're going to style these classes. So we're going to style the video-author as well as the video stats. And we're going to set both of these to display inline-block. And this one as well, display inline-block. I'm going to introduce a little bit of CSS syntax here. If we have two sets of CSS styles that are the same, we can actually use a different syntax by adding a comma here. That are the stats. And we're going to set both of these to display inline-block. And this one as well, display inline-block. I'm going to introduce a little bit of CSS syntax here. If we have two sets of CSS styles that are the same, we can actually use a different syntax by adding a comma here. So this comma means that we're going to target both the video author class and the video stats class with this set of styles. So this is how we target multiple things in CSS with a comma. So as you can see, these two elements now appear beside each other. They're both inline block elements and only take up as much space as they need to. If we click the top left in the DevTools and hover over this, you'll notice that this paragraph is now only taking up as much space as the text, and the same thing for this paragraph. So as you can see, even though paragraphs by default are block elements, we can change them very easily to inline block with the display property. So that we can put them beside each other. Next, we're going to try the opposite direction. We're going to go from an inline block element to a block element. And we're going to put these two on separate lines. So let's go into our code, and we're going to style the thumbnail class. So I'm going to scroll up here, and I'm going to convert this to display block. And now it will turn the image into a display block, and this will cause the image to take up the entire line, pushing the text box down to the next line. If I save it, now you can see that this image is taking up the entire line. I'm going to verify this by clicking the top left and then hovering over this image. So using this property, we can control whether an element appears on the same line or on a different line. And that's what we're going to do to copy this design. The search bar is at the top. We have an image and then 3 paragraphs, each on a different line. So we're going to use the display property to achieve this. Let's go into our code, and first let's put the search box at the top. Save it. And since our image is already display block, it's going to take up the entire line, so it's forced to take up a line below the search box. So I think this is pretty good. As long as the search box is up there, then we're good to go. Next, we're going to turn these back into display block because we want these on separate lines, like our design here. So to do that, we're going to go into our code And we could change this to display block, but remember that paragraphs by default are display block. So we can just get rid of this code. Save it, and now our elements are appearing at least in the same structure as the design, from top to bottom, and each element is taking up its own line. So that is the display property. It allows us to control how an element is displayed, whether they're a block element and take up the whole line, or they're an inline block element and only take up as much space as they need to.
like invert the camera. Yeah, it's nice. Hmm. Obviously. No, it looks nice. I like light colored glasses. Show the dark one. Yeah, different frame, no? Hmm. 3 you're taking. Ah, okay, fine. Yeah, it looks nice. Send one picture of it. Send one picture. doing different. I did the same thing locally, and this does not work. So we have 16 pixels of padding. Yeah. I'm dying. Can I have four? 336. Oh my god. I figured it out. I think so. This is not getting aligned. This is killing me. Okay, we're gonna redo all of it. Okay.
You're doing HTML.
CSS.
Align का option होता था left, right, center.
reasonable, no? No one is. No. This makes no sense. This makes no sense. Holy shit, how did you do this? One plus that's fucking hard. Add this up for me, see? Abby, add this up for me. 10 plus 230 plus 10, 250 plus 5, 255, right? No, now it's overshot.
Wait.
How? So how is it overshot? Is what I'm 10 plus 230 plus 10 plus 10 because that's the other side, right? So you're saying 245,
Yeah.
too small.
So then we get 250.
Correct, but how do I get the exact measure?
I don't think you add the amount.
Oh, because there's an invisible border on the left. That makes sense. So if I do margin left, right. So now it's 5 plus 10 plus 230 plus 10 plus 5, 20 plus 230, 250. But then again, it's falling short.
What about the border? Just a border.
0 pixels. point isn't trying to eyeball it. Yeah, why is that not working is what I'm so confused about. Whatever. No, but this is slightly behind now. So the point. That's not the point.
Wait, what is 235?
It's, I'll show you how it's 235. No, it's not saying no. This is 235 because it's adding 5 plus 10 plus 100 plus 10 plus 5. So 120
Yeah, plus 10, 130.
120 plus 120. So how did I get 235? Where did I lose 5? It's 5 pixels. 10 plus 20 plus 100. 150. 10 plus 20 plus 100. 130 is the whole thing. Okay. So 260 minus 10 plus 20. 230 should be the size. But why is it small? 40 fuck, I'm fucking dying. Why is it small? What am I missing? What is it? Is it zero? What is the width of this whole container? I want to understand. It's supposed to be 5 plus 10 plus 100 plus 10 plus 5, right? That's 1. And then the second one. Yeah, so 5 plus 10.
Wait. You
Fif-
want to add the 5 twice because you're sharing it on the middle.
Where?
In the middle.
They're not sharing it. Look, that one covers its right side. Okay. And then
I got it.
this one covers its left side. So that's 10 total.
Yeah.
Fuck this, I'm not doing it now.
In this lesson, we're going to learn about the most important HTML element called the div element.
I have no idea.
For example, here's twitter.com. If you look at the HTML that Twitter uses, you can see that they're using lots and lots of divs. Here's another example, Instagram. If we look at Instagram's HTML, we can also see that they're using lots and lots of divs. So what exactly is a div and why is it used so much? So the div element stands for division, but an easy way to understand this is that the div is just a box. We're going to go into our code and look at an example. So below our paragraphs, let's create a div element. And inside we're going to have some text. This is a div. Save it, and now we have our first div element on the page. To show you that the div is just a box, we're going to right click and inspect. And then we're going to click this top left icon and hover over the div. So as you can see, we created a box around our text. you'll notice that this box stretches to the end, and that's because the div, like the paragraph, by default is a block element, so it takes up the entire line. But like we learned in the previous lesson, we can easily change this to an inline block using the display property. So let's go ahead and do that, and it'll be more clear that this is really a box. So we're going to set a class here. We're going to call this div-example. And now we're going to style it and change the display to inline block so that it doesn't take up the entire line anymore. Save it. And now if we go to our webpage, click this icon and hover over, you can clearly see that the div just creates a box around our content. In this case, our content is some text.
See, it's even Claude got a little bit different. Oh, fuck it. Claude is getting it wrong then.
Text. So that's basically what a div is. Now the second question is, why is a div so useful? The key feature of a div is that it can contain any other elements inside. So right now we only have some text inside this div, but we can actually put, here's another example from Twitter. Here's a container, here's another container, and here's another container. In order to build a complex real-world website, we need containers to group our elements together and lay them out on the page. And the div is the perfect container, just like our final project. So I'm going to get rid of this text dash pre. Now save. And you might not notice any difference because the div is simply just drawing a box around the content inside. But we can right click and inspect, and we can see the div in our HTML here. And inside the div, we have our image and our paragraphs. The div is just creating a box around all this content. So now I'll show you why containers are so useful. We're going to go to our code, and we're going to change the width of our div element here. So we're going to go up here and we can remove this. Let's style the video preview class. And we're going to set a width of 300 pixels. Let's see how that looks. So the page doesn't look any different, but if we click the icon in the top left and then hover over our paragraphs, we'll notice something interesting. This paragraph is a block element, so it's supposed to take up the entire line. But in this case, because this paragraph is inside a div, it takes up the entire line in the div. So the way that block elements actually work is that they take up the entire line in their container rather than on the page. So that's really useful because if we look at our final project, so for these paragraphs, we want them to appear on separate lines like this. So we do want them to take up their own line, but we don't necessarily want them to take up the line on the entire page because we have some stuff on the right side here. So to solve this problem, we put the paragraphs inside a container so that they take up their own line in the container and not in the page. And that's how we can create a layout like this. Let's go back to our website. If we hover over our div now, so this blue box on the left is our container. It groups all the elements together and keeps it within that blue area that you see. Now, a really cool thing about this is that notice that the blue box doesn't actually take up the entire page. So we can actually have a second box beside it on the right. So we can add another blue box on the right containing another video preview. So now we're going to do that. But first of all, a div by default is a block element. So notice on the right side, it's all orange. That's because this div is taking up the entire line. In this case, we don't want it to take up the entire line anymore. That's why we're going to convert it into an inline block element. So let's go into our code. We're going to go into the video preview and we're going to type display inline block. Let's save it. And now you can see that our div is a display inline block. It's actually appearing beside our search bar because this is also an inline block. So they're both only taking up as much space as they need to, and now they can appear beside each other. However, we do want the search box to be at the top in its own line. So we're going to practice using the display property again. We're going to set the search bar to display block so that it takes up the entire line and everything else is forced below it. Save it and refresh. And now if we hover over this input element, we can see that we forced it to take up the entire line. Next, we're going to create another video preview beside this one. Because this is inline block now, we can put another div here. So I'm just going to simplify this by making a copy of our current code. So I'm just going to copy and paste. And now we have two video previews. Save it. And there we go. We now have two video previews beside each other. So they are two containers right beside each other. And remember, in our CSS, we set the width of these containers to 300 pixels. So that's the amount of space that they take. And we set their display to inline block. So they don't take up the entire line and they can appear beside each other. And now we're on our way to creating a layout that looks like this. In fact, let's actually replace the second video preview here with this content. Now, to control swap out, here's a container is actually, so we learned this taller than these. We have two different video previews, but now we have a problem. You'll notice that these two aren't aligned with each other. And that's because this container is actually a little bit taller than this one. This piece of text here wraps around to a second line while this one does not. However, to make it look better, we want to align these at the top. So we learned this way back in one of the earlier lessons, and we're going to review how to do that. We're going to go into our code, and we just have to set this property, vertical align. And we're going to set it to top, so that these elements align at the top. I'm going to save it, and now that looks pretty good. We now have two different video previews, and they are aligned with each other. The last thing we'll do is to add some space between them. So remember, the space outside of an element is called margin, and we're going to add margin to this entire container right now. So we'll go into our code, and in the video preview styles, we're going to add margin dash right. And let's set it to something like 15 pixels. Save it, and now we added margin on the right. And now the interesting thing about this is if we right click and inspect, and then in our HTML, we find our div, which is here, you'll see that the margin is applied on the entire div. So that's how the div element works. It's a container that groups other elements together so that we can create complex layouts like this and eventually our YouTube project.